Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point of the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen, which will reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's Casual Friday, I have some tidbits. I have a finished object. I have some whips and rips. And I have an answer to a question from one of you. And I have some organizational dilemmas to work through. So let's get started. This first tidbit came up in either my Instagram feed or my Twitter feed. I really don't remember. It came up in the form of a link to a newspaper article about a woman who makes these little crocheted dolls, and she likes to make them with different skin tones to help each child relate to the doll that they have. And she was having trouble doing that. So she partnered with Lion Brand, who is working on a line of yarn colors that would do this sort of thing. And so they've come out with, it's called Skein Tones is the name of the line of yarns. It's 12 different neutral colors in various shades of browns. There's some that are very pale beige or rosy beige, and all the way into like a terracotta and mahogany and ebony and all different colors in between. So it's a fantastic range of colors. But one of the goals was also to produce a line of neutral tones that could work with stranded color work. So a lot of times people are working with several bright colors and they want a neutral to go with it. And this was a solution that they came to. Now the yarn is 100% acrylic, so if you are a wool lover like me, it may not suit you exactly. But for things like making toys, those are absolutely something that acrylic would be perfect for. So I'll leave a link both to the article that came up in my feed as well as to the webpage for Lion Brand, so you can see the colors of all 12 shades. In last week's Casual Friday, I was talking about Dorset buttons, which originated in Dorset, England, and became a cottage industry until about the mid-19th century, when manufactured buttons became possible and very popular. And gradually that cottage industry went into decline. People today still make Dorset buttons either for historical clothing or even just as a decorative object rather than as something for clothing. So I was talking about that last week, and somebody in my Ravelry group mentioned that those types of buttons were very popular in Austria and I believe parts of Germany and that part of Europe. And it was something that children were given that task to do. So it was very poorly paid work, but it was very commonly done there as well. So I started looking into it. And this type of button that was so popular there was used for the same purposes and have a lot in common with a Dorset button. There certainly are thread buttons. They have some slightly different techniques, and I started going down a rabbit hole looking at various videos for the different types of buttons. So what I'm going to do is leave a link to the Ravelry thread where we were talking about that, because people were giving different links, and there's links to videos and discussions about the names for these different types of buttons, because there were a couple of different names that were being thrown around. So if you're interested in these thread buttons like we were talking about last week with the Dorset buttons, this might be something that's interesting to you. One person that posted to that thread posted a picture of a gorgeous button that had basically a picture. It was like embroidered flowers within the button, and that seems to be something that artists are doing more these days. It wasn't something that would have been done back then, but it's another way that these kinds of thread buttons are being used as embellishments. This next tidbit is a photograph, which I'll show you right here, of a woman in her sporting attire. It was a portrait taken in a studio, but she's got her golf clubs and she's got her golfing sweater on. And what I love about this sweater, and I will leave a link so you can look at this video in more detail if you want. It's from the National Galleries of Scotland. And what I love about it is how high resolution the photograph is compared to if you were looking at a knitting book from that time period, even an original. Often you can't see that level of detail in the stitch patterning. And so that is what I thought was really interesting, is just to see all that detail. So I will leave a link to that photograph down below. This next tidbit is about an online event that is going to be on Friday, April 9th from 12 to, I believe it's 1:30. I believe it's an hour and a half, Central Daylight Time here in the US, so it will be later in Europe. I'm going to leave a link to the website as well as to a link to the Eventbrite ticket reservation location. So this website is called materializingrace.com, and they say the beauty of material culture is that it often takes non-verbal forms, in the process bearing witness to the lives and experiences of those absent from or written out of traditional archival records. With participant-driven virtual conferences and a desire to explore other forms of interrogation and connection, we are committed to recovering those stories through object-centered scholarship. So this is really part 2 of a 2-part series. The first part was back in September. I knew nothing about it, and I believe they had a conference or an unconference the month before as well. So what they're saying about this event on April 9th is that building off our first Materializing Race unconference in 2020, we invite you to join us for Activation and Engagement 2, Making as interrogatory, I can't say that word, interrogatory method. This free Zoom event is the second in a 2-part series focused on bringing historical issues of race and identity to the forefront of museum and historic site programming and the public humanities more broadly. Our focus is on the Americas between roughly 1450 and 1830. There's more information at these 2 links, but to me it sounded really interesting. As somebody who is more interested in social history than I am in political history, and the history of people who are actually in power, I'm more interested in the people who didn't have as much power or any power, and just how they lived their lives. So I think this could be really interesting, and I have already signed up for it. I am often asked to suggest knitting reference books, or I'm asked about my knitting library, or I'm asked to give a little tour of my knitting library, and I've done that a couple of times on Casual Fridays. The most recent time was the fall of 2019. I did a series of probably 6 weeks where I went through my knitting library by category and talked about the different books. But one book that I talk about often is this book right here, this Knitter's Handbook by Montse Stanley. It is my favorite reference book. It's the one I reach for first. Now, it isn't the only one I reach for. Sometimes I have a question and I deliberately want to see how each book describes a particular technique, or how they present them, or what labels they give to a particular technique. Whenever I'm looking at multiple books, hers is one of them. Now, this book is out of print, but it's still available secondhand. Now, what I would recommend if you want to get a copy of this book, it's pretty easy to get a copy of this book for $5 or $10 used. I looked on AbeBooks earlier today to see what they had. And they have, this is the cover of, this is paperback, and this is the cover from 1999 or 2001, or perhaps both of them. And AbeBooks also has a hardcover copy that's probably from the 1993. I don't know that the inside is any different. I don't know that this is a second edition. It's just the Reader's Digest edition, and this one happens to be paperback. So you can get any of these, either copy of the book, for just a few dollars. There are some sellers who are trying to sell it for $40 or $175, really ridiculous prices. You should not have to pay that. There are multiple copies available on AbeBooks for $6, $8, $10. And probably it varies based on the condition that they're in. But this is a really great book. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because my friend Oli Petter had heard me, who lives in Sweden, had heard me on one of my podcasts talking about Montse Stanley. And he sent me a link to a little biographical sketch about her. He didn't know if I'd ever read it. I had read it, but I'd forgotten some of it. And so I'm going to leave that with you, because she is originally from Spain. And she lived there until she was in her early 30s when she moved to the UK with her husband. She was trained as an architect, but I don't believe she ever worked as an architect. But she was so surprised at the difference in the way people in the UK knit by following patterns, where in Spain she had learned to knit by knitting to a specific person's measurement, making a sweater for that person. And so she thought about knitting in a very different way, like what kind of sweater do I want to make, and what kinds of things do I want to add to it, what kind of sleeve do I want, what kind of increases am I going to use, what kind of decreases, that kind of thing. And so this book is really full of a lot of information about how to do things. One of the things I love about this is just the section on decreases, where she always tells you what the mirror of that decrease is, and she tells you how to work it on the wrong side of the work, on the purl side if you need to. So she always has every different version of doing it. So I really love this book and I highly recommend it. But if you are curious about Montse Stanley and want to learn a little bit more about her, you might want to read that link. It's a biographical sketch that's on the Knitting History Forum's website. Oh, and one more thing. When she died, she apparently left her copyright to the University of Southampton. And you can see the evidence of that on the copyright page of this book. So this edition was published in like 1999 or 2001. Montse Stanley died in 1999. So this is why I don't think that this is a second edition. It's just the Reader's Digest edition of it. In addition to leaving her copyright to the University of Southampton, she also left them her vast collection of knitting manuals. And so the University of Southampton has digitized those books, and you can look at them on archive.org in the Knitting Reference Library section. I'll leave a link to that down there. I've mentioned the Knitting Reference Library many times. I don't think if the books are still under copyright, they probably won't be, you probably can't see them, so you probably aren't seeing her entire collection. In addition to her books, there also is a collection of Victorian knitting manuals that I believe all belong to Richard Rutt, who wrote a book called The History of Hand Knitting. So also a real scholar when it came to knitting. But all of those books are available to see in digitized format on archive.org, which is a fantastic resource if you're interested in knitting history and looking at these old knitting manuals and seeing what they were like. So in the past 6 or 7 months, I've done several different videos on yarn constructions. And for each video, I focus on a particular effect that some yarns might have on fabric. So like, why do my stitches look weird? And so I explain, how yarns are constructed that might cause yarns to have, instead of look like a V, have one leg that's straight up and one leg that goes off at an angle. So that's one type of thing to look out for and be aware of. And I talk about, here's how you tell those yarns apart from each other. Then I did a video that was about chainette yarns and yarns that are called blown yarns or blow yarns. Sometimes they're called that. And how they're constructed and what they're good for and how they behave and how can you tell what those look like. And then I did a video on the direction of the twist that yarns have, whether it has an S twist versus a Z twist, and how do you tell that? So one of the questions I get in those videos pretty often is, do the yarn labels tell you what kind of construction the yarn is? And the answer is no. I mean, occasionally they might, but typically they do not. So the places that you can find out, if you're wondering something about a particular yarn, like this yarn doesn't look like what I'm used to, and you don't know why, then you can go to Yarn Sub yarnsub.com and look up the yarn. And if there's something unusual about that yarn, that will be mentioned in there. Another place that you can look is on Ravelry. So yarnsub.com is more consistent in terms of how they categorize different features of yarns, whereas Ravelry is a user-created database, and whoever creates the entry on a particular yarn may or may not include something about the construction, or they might state it slightly differently than somebody else might state it. Both are good ways of finding information, and I would always recommend checking both of them if you are curious. It's also a good way to find yarns that have a particular construction type. Like if you're interested in trying out a blow yarn or blown yarn, you can look that up on yarnsub.com and see what yarns are out there that would have that quality that you might be able to get your hands on. This might feel a little overwhelming, like, well, how am I supposed to know how this yarn is constructed? And you learn it the same way you learn other things about knitting, the same way you learn what a crew neck is versus a V-neck, versus a boat neck, versus a turtleneck. You see that those two things are different, and you say, what is the name for that? Or you see something called a turtleneck or a V-neck. Like, what is that? And then you find out. So you look at the yarns that you have in your stash and look for differences and look for similarities, and see if you can divide things up in terms of different families. And when you look at those videos that I've done, and they're all in a playlist called Yarn on my channel, which I'll link to above and down in the description, that when you can divide these things up into categories, then you can kind of decipher and learn to read what a yarn is, so that when you go to a yarn shop, you can look at a yarn and go, oh, this is a chainette yarn, or oh, this is a single. So the first thing is just to identify what kind of yarn they are, and then you can learn what kinds of projects or what kinds of stitch patterns those particular yarn constructions are best with. But it's just all part of the learning process. It can be a little harder if you're buying online. Sometimes it's a little harder if the photographs aren't very good, or you can't zoom in very well. But if you see a yarn that you like and you're wondering what the construction is, then you can go to YarnSub or Ravelry and look that yarn up and see what information you can find about the construction. And then when you get your hands on the yarn, really look at it and see, how is this yarn different from this other yarn? So you just have to train yourself to look at these things and learn about them so that you will know. And if you see something that you've never heard of before, you're like, what is this? Ask somebody or take a picture of it and then post it and say, what is this? Can anybody tell me more about this construction? But that's the way all of us learn, is just one piece at a time and gradually putting all the puzzle pieces together. So I have a little finished object to show you, which is this little guy. He is a gnome. And this is a design by Sarah Shira. I'll leave a link down in the description. She does a lot of these gnome designs. She's got a bunch of different patterns. This particular pattern came with 3 different gnomes. This is the large gnome. It's about 8.5 inches, which is a little bit more than 20 centimeters from base to the top of the head. They all have a little nose peeking out underneath their cap. And they all have little arms. I think they all have arms, and they have a little beard. Oftentimes the beards are done in the same color as the nose, but I wanted to do something a little different. Now, I usually don't like doing toys. I mean, I like the way they look, but a lot of times they're kind of futzy and they're, hard to put together, or pain in the rear to put together. This really wasn't that bad at all. It didn't take very long, and she tells you exactly, well, she tells you approximately how much you're going to need in terms of grams or yards of different fingering weights. So I have a whole bin of leftover sock yarns. So I just went through and looked for things that I thought would go together. And it was really fun to be able to use like sock yarn that I know what socks this is from, and to be able to put them all together like that was pretty fun. So this is the large gnome in the pattern Never Not Gnoming. She does gnomes all the time. The other 2 are much smaller, and one could be used as an ornament and one could be used as to sit down. So to stuff them, you use fiberfill, and to give some weight to it, you're supposed to put those little poly pellets in it. And I didn't have any, and I just didn't want to do that. So my little guy can stand up on his own, but he can fall over easily. He's not weighted. Somebody in our social Zoom knitting group last night, she had made one, and she had tied a few washers together from the hardware store, and just to give it a little bit of weight, she did it that way. So there are other ways to add weight to it if you wanted to, but this was fun. It was he's adorable. So I think it took me, I think I did this over a period of 2 days. I did part of it one day and then the rest of the second day. It really didn't take very long at all. So I have never been a person who's really fixed my knitting. Like it doesn't fall apart, and I don't ever think about making sure I save a certain amount of yarn that's labeled with what sweater. I've just never done that. I've just lived dangerously. And what I was telling you guys last week was that I realized a couple of weeks ago when I was wearing this Aran sweater, which is absolutely one of my favorite sweaters, that I want to be able to wear this for another 20, 30 years, that I noticed that I was wearing a white t-shirt underneath it, and I could see that it was really thin in the elbows. When I take the sweater off, I can't see it. There's no hole. It's just very, very thin. And I discovered last week, because it's been 15 years since I knit this sweater, and I was like, there's no leftovers. And I remembered I had the swatch. The other day, I was wearing a short sleeve t-shirt with this big sweater coat that I made a few years ago, and I just actually did repair the cuffs on that earlier this year because they were kind of loose and they would get caught, and I think I singed them on the oven. So that was like the first time I ever really did a repair on a sweater. And then I also knit myself a belt to go with it and some belt loops to make the sweater nicer for me. I still have a little bit of that yarn left. I was wearing the short sleeve t-shirt, and I moved my arm and I could like feel cold air blowing on it. And I was like, so I looked. And so I have this habit. It used to be years ago when I knit, I just knit where my kids were little. I would knit, at the playground, or I'd knit at the doctor's office in the waiting room, or I'd knit in the car line waiting for them to get out of the car, or at their sporting events, or in the restaurant waiting to get seated. I always had a sock with me, so I would knit anywhere. But now I always knit in my office, and I sit at my desk chair, which has these arms on them. And one of the things I do is I lean on this left elbow. And I was telling you guys, I think recently, about my knitting style. Oh, I did a video a few weeks ago, technique video on continental knitting, and I was mentioning that I keep my right hand needle very still. Like I bring the two needles together, but once they're together, I don't insert my right needle. I mount the left needle on it. And so what I do is I have my elbow on the arm of my desk chair, and I'm just doing this. My elbow is dug into the soft arm of my desk chair, and then I just rotate my arm like this. And so that is what's wearing through these elbows. And so I can fix these, but somebody was asking last night in the social knitting group, what are you going to do to prevent this from happening again with this, not only this sweater, but other sweaters? I said, I don't know. I've been trying to figure out what I can do that would work for any kind of sweater, whether it was stockinette or textured pattern or whatever, and it wouldn't look weird, like it wouldn't be obvious. And Susan Rainey, who's in our Knitters Guild, she had an idea. And well, first of all, she thought that I should use these suede leather patches that I bought years ago. She thought I should put those on my Aran sweater. She thought they would look good. So I'm like, well, maybe I will. I'm going to try fixing it, and then I'll see what I think, because these can just be sewn on and taken right off if I decide I don't like it. But her idea for prevention was one that she had when her husband was in the hospital and the bed sheets were really rough and it were really bugging his elbow. And so she made him these tubes of polar fleece that he could just put on his arms, and then it would protect his elbows. And she said you could just keep that up on your desk. You could have them different diameters based on how chunky your sweater is. And then when you sit down at your desk, just put that little tube on over your elbow, and that way you can protect the sleeve. So I thought that was a really good idea. So I'm going to try that and see how it works. So I need to fix this sweater, and then I need to fix my dog coat. And in the meantime, I finally painted my old office and moved my daughter's furniture in there, and I emptied out this closet. It's in my new office, which was her old bedroom. It had all her clothes were still in the closet. So I emptied that closet out, moved the last few things of my old office in here, and I've been going through things. And I found a couple of sweaters in a bin that are commercially made, and they're my husband's, which is probably why I didn't remember they were in here. And they have holes in them that needed to be repaired. So I'm going to try some mending. I'm going to try just some actual darning and see if that works for these, because these are very, very fine gauge commercially knit. It's not like I can really repair it so that you can't see it, but I might be able to repair it in a way that isn't super obnoxious, and he'd at least be able to wear them again. So I'm accumulating this pile of things that need to be repaired. But the other thing that I came across was a bag of some partially knit sweaters that I had completely forgotten about. And the reason I had forgotten about them was I had bought yarn. I had bought 20 balls, 50-gram balls of several different colors. Like one of them was this purple. And I had started a sweater with this purple yarn. I was designing something, it didn't quite work out, and I stuffed it in a bag, and I totally forgot about it. And then when I decided to knit this sweater, I had enough of the purple yarn, and I knit it. And so I just found this bag of this half-finished or partially finished sweater made of this yarn. And so I thought, well, one of the things I'm going to do is weigh all that yarn so I can kind of estimate how much there is. And I put it in a Ziploc. And so I have like 250 grams of this purple yarn that's available, but I also had some smaller bits made from this purple yarn. And so I started another bag, and let me open this up. So I have like something that looks like maybe it was a partial sleeve or something. I don't know what it was. It's got some cables on it. I was trying something with some increases. So I'm saving this, and I'm putting some swatches that are for specific sweaters in Ziploc bags, because what I've done in the past, if I've even kept them, is to shove them in this one bin with all of my swatches, and as I dig through them, they rub against each other and they get a little bit felted. So I want to keep the swatches that are for my actual finished sweaters in a separate container so that I will have yarn available, because I never before needed to repair anything, because I don't think anything was old enough before or that was nice enough that I wanted to wear it as long as I've been wearing the sweaters that I wear today. I've also got some swatches for the yarn that I used to knit my World War I sweater. So I have some of that. And I've got my sweater coat yarn as well. So I'm keeping all of this stuff together, and it's going to be a plan that I have for the future, because I am starting to see that things as they age, they are getting holes, and I didn't used to care. But now I'm like, well, but I like this sweater. I don't want to get rid of it. So I'm going to explore fixing things with the yarn if I have it, and then if I don't, then I'll look into either visible mending or slightly more visible than I would normally like mending for these repairs. But I'm getting a pile of things that need to be repaired, and it's getting warmer and warmer, so I won't be needing these sweaters anytime soon. So we'll see how long it takes. Somebody asked me recently if I would take you guys on my journey in fixing these things. And I will as much as I can. Some of the things, like the sweater coat is black yarn. Like you can't see what I'm doing when I'm working on it. I tried filming something earlier when I was making the sweater cuffs or repairing the sweater cuffs, and it's just really hard to see what was going on. And the other thing is that some of these repairs I understand how to do theoretically, but because I don't do them regularly, I've done a repair maybe one time for a friend's socks. It's not a situation where I can just, okay, now I'm going to demonstrate how to do this, because I'm going to be trying to figure out what I'm doing and seeing if I can do it correctly. So I certainly will show before and after photos, but I don't know that I'll be able to show the process of me while I'm doing it, because I just don't know enough about it yet. So I have a new work in progress. It's a short one. It'll probably be done probably done this weekend. It's a hat. It's an 1898 hat. And I'll put information about this down below, and I'll put something on the screen. I can't remember the name of the organization. It's a free pattern, and it's a pattern I've made for like all the men in my life. I've made one for my husband, my brother, my mom's husband, my grandnephew. I've made one for myself. But they came up with this pattern that was based on, I think, from a photograph of a similar hat, which is why they call it the 1898 hat, something from the late 19th century. The way it starts is with a garter stitch border, and really what you're doing is you're knitting it, it's double wide. You're knitting garter stitch the whole width, so you're knitting both layers. You knit in these ear flaps, and one of the things that's nice about them is that in the midpoint, there are 3 slip stitches. So you knit them on the right side and you slip them on the wrong side. So it looks kind of like I-cord. And because it's not as stretchy, because they're slip stitches, it causes those ear flaps to kind of curl in, and they really hug in around the bottoms of the ears. So this double thick layer is really warm. So after you knit this and you fold it in half, then the idea is that you pick up stitches all along the edge, all the way around, and then you knit the crown of the hat. So you knit straight for a little bit, and then you do your crown decreases. And one of my husband's comments about it was the ear flaps with the garter stitch and the double thickness are nice and warm, but it's not as warm on top because it's a single layer. So what a lot of people do is they do something to add an extra layer. They either knit 2 layers by knitting an outer layer and then an inner layer, because you have 2 edges here, so you can pick up along one edge and knit an outer hat and pick up on the inner edge and then do an inner hat. You could do double knitting instead. Some people do stranded color work. You could add cables. There's a lot of things you can do to add extra thickness. So the reason I'm knitting this hat is because our Knitters Guild, there's somebody who does a lot of service project knitting. And this year our guild's service project, we have like 3 organizations that we're knitting for, but one of them is hats for the homeless. And the criteria are that they be warm Minnesota hats. They really want that double layer of knitting around the ears, full coverage. It has to be able to come all the way down and turn over. So this is the kind of hat that would suit that purpose because it has that double layer. So I wanted to knit the 2 inner and outer layer hat to make that double warm on top as well. Someone in our guild wanted to do was pick a free pattern and do this periodically. Pick a free pattern and everybody knit something. You could knit it for yourself, or you could do it as part of the service project and come up with a variation, like do your own take on it. Like what kind of variation do you want to do? And then we would just share them with each other and let everybody in the guild know in a blog post, like here's my variation, here's my variation, here's how I tweaked it. And so that's what I'm doing this hat for. But it's just such a great pattern. I really like it. I just picked up stitches around the edge along one of the edges so that I can do 1 layer of the crown, and then after I finish that, I'll do the other. I think the 100 grams of yarn is enough for the whole hat. I'm a little worried that I'm going to be cutting it close, but I do have some other yarn that's very close to this. The Aran sweater I made recently from Zwartbles yarn is very close in color. It's a little different in texture, but if it's up on the inside of the hat, it won't be noticeable at all. So I think I can make the whole thing with just the 100 grams of worsted weight. I'm taking a little break from my 1960s sweater, but I thought I'd update you on that and just let you know what's going on. I started the third ball of yarn for the upper part of the back, and I'm looking at it and I'm wondering if my gauge has changed, or if when I did a wash and block testing, if I didn't pay attention to not stretching it out. I don't know if I stretched it out or if I'm just looser than I thought I was. So it's looking like it might be a little too wide, and then I'm worried about the yarn quantity. So I think what I'm going to do is put the back on pause, because at this point I don't think I could rip out the back again and re-knit it right now. Like, that would be a little too much for me. So I think what I might do is cast on for one of the fronts, and then I'll pay more attention to how much yarn it takes to knit the ribbing with the smaller needles, and also how many stitches do I get per gram when I'm knitting the Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing on the smaller needles versus when I switch to the larger needles and I'm knitting in stockinette, how many stitches per gram I get with that. So I think that will help me, and then really pay more attention to the gauge with the front and making sure that I am getting the correct gauge, and if I'm not, do I need to just go down slightly. Like, I'm using a US 2, which is a 2.75 millimeter needle, and I think if I need to go down, it would be to a 2.5 millimeter needle, which is a US 1.5. So I don't know. So like I said, I had to give a little time out. I'm gonna maybe try blocking the back again and see if I block it to make sure that I'm blocking to the right measurement, and see if it does come out the right size or if it is too big, and then deal with that. So I just want to give a brief update on that particular project. My other work in progress is something I've been working on for 3 months, which is this office space. So I was pretty confident with how I wanted my yarn knitting tools and my video recording equipment to be set up, and that's been set up since the beginning. I've been tweaking some of the video equipment. I've been adding some equipment, replacing some equipment to make things work better. But and all that's fine. But one of the things that I wanted to add to this room is I wanted to bring my spinning supplies in here and figure out how I can also use my spinning wheel in here without necessarily having it set up permanently, but at least be stored in here, my spinning equipment. So I needed to figure that out. And then recently I decided I wanted to get back into sewing, and most of my sewing stuff, or all of it really, has been stored down in the basement room that it's like a dungeon. I don't like being down there, and for years it had a really bad fluorescent light. I couldn't even see very well down there. Well, we've got a better light down there so I can see all the cobwebs that have been accumulating over the years. But I want to move my sewing stuff up here, and so that is something I have to think about in a completely different way. How do I organize my sewing things and my sewing notions? I think I have plenty of room, but it's just a matter of figuring it out. So I've been spending the past week sitting at my desk, staring at this closet, trying to imagine how I would use it, because it's really important for me to somehow visually see my things, even if they're not out in the open, that if they're somehow contained, that I can visually see them. So I realized I needed to use a label maker. That helps, because even if I can't see what's in something, if I can see the words on them, that I see those words over and over again, that will help me. It will help remind me of what I have. So that was like a revelation for me, that the labels can really help me. I've had labels in my office before, but then as I've reorganized things, I never adjusted the labels. The labels just got more and more outdated. So I'm redoing labels and rethinking how I want to do things. And hopefully next week I can show you guys the wall that's behind the camera that I haven't shown you. And I'll be able to get that set up and show you how the entire room is set up. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really happy about getting my daughter's room set up for her. I got it all painted. I got her furniture moved in. So as soon as we're all vaccinated, she'll be able to come up and see us. But if any of you who are like me, where you're organized but not very tidy and you have that need to see your things, I could use some tips for sewing notions, because sewing things are a little bit different than knitting stuff. Or maybe it's just that I knit so much, I'm much more comfortable knowing how to organize my knitting supplies. So if you guys have gone through this where you've had to organize your sewing room, and I don't want somebody who's like type A, super tidy, and everything's out of sight. That's not going to help me, because I don't have that ability, and I'm not going to learn that. So if you feel like you have an organizational style that's sort of like mine, I would really appreciate any tips that you might have about how you organize your sewing equipment. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.